So let's kick things off with a brief introduction to Labor IQ by Think Why and our expert panelists. Labor IQ by Think Why is the first platform to deliver salary answers and location and industry performance, providing talent solutions and market opportunity insights for recruiting and business growth, covering all U.S. locations and industries and over 20,000 job titles. Whether you need precise salary data to win talent or planning solutions to grow your business, Labor IQ is the talent technology for you. So now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce today's expert panelists. First, we have Dr. Marianne Wanamaker, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Tennessee and a Research Associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Marianne is the former Chief Domestic Economist and Senior Labor Economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, and she has expertise in American labor markets, education, and workforce development. She currently serves on the Federal Workforce Policy Advisory Board, tasked with advising federal policy on workforce issues. Today, we'll also hear from Jay Denton, Senior Vice President of Business Intelligence and Chief Innovation Officer at Think Why. With more than 15 years of experience in software as a service organizations, Jay supports Think Why's mission to provide businesses with a strategic advantage in talent acquisition. Before we get started, we invite you to connect with us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Follow Jay at Labor Market Guru on Twitter and get the latest resources updates through Think Why's LinkedIn page listed here. You can connect with Marianne on Twitter as well, using her handle at MWANAMAK, or search Marianne Wanamaker on LinkedIn. Now let's get started. Today, our panelists will be covering several topics. First, we'll begin with a review of the current labor market conditions and the continued impact of COVID-19 on the labor market. Then we'll dive into diversity and demographics and what we're seeing across the nation and in certain sectors. Last, we'll take a look at the road to recovery and examine the jobs forecast for our key locations and industries. With the impact from the pandemic, May through July marked the 3 largest months of job gain on record. Still, there's a long way to go to fully recover all the jobs that have been lost. With the recovery underway, hiring to refill roles has been robust, but the results have varied based on the type of business and even the location. What differences are we seeing, and what does that mean for individuals? As we turn to Jay for the answer, we also have a couple of poll questions for you. Jay, if you can take it away.
Okay, and thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Marianne, for joining once again. The last time that you and I spoke on one of these webinars, we had just gotten the very first piece of data showing that the recovery had began. So the very last time during the early part of the summer, our title was The Recovery Begins. And so here we are. We've now actually recaptured half of the jobs, but the pace is slowing. So Marianne, you study the labor market as much as anybody I know. What do you think when you look at today's numbers?
Yeah, well, you hate to see the September number. That's a pace that's going to take us a while to get back to full recovery. You think about less than 1 million jobs added in September, and we still have 10 million to go. So I know you're going to show us a forecast later on, but the math would tell you we have a long road in front of us.
Yeah, we'll hit a few points along the way. The outlook we'll get to at the end of it, but certainly you'll hear us layering in some thoughts of what the rest of this year looks like and into next year and perhaps beyond. I think, you know, as we've talked back and forth throughout the summer, watching things like the unemployment insurance claims, the pace of that starting to slow down from one week to the next, certainly one of the indicators we watch. But we said a while back that once we got to fall, we would expect this pace of, you know, 1 million+ jobs in a single month. It would certainly slow down. Below that, you know, with the latest numbers with September, we've seen it. I think we'll probably see it again in October. Now, the thing when we, you know, it's not a one size fits all, and that'll be a theme as we talk about really the shuffle in talent from one industry to another, one market to another, you know, certain types of businesses and so on. But when you think about the industries, so we've talked about, you know, that from a national standpoint, we're halfway back, but that's not quite the same on an industry basis. So as you look at some of the numbers on the page here of, you know, the ones that have been impacted the most or the least, you know, from your standpoint, what are the key notes here?
Well, you know, the title today is the talent shuffle. And as you just said, recoveries are all about shuffles. They're about taking workers from one industry and allocating them to another one. And so in the 2008 recession, economists talk about that recession a lot, of course, because it was just such a monumental moment in economic history. But there was a lot of reshuffling in that recession from construction. So it was a housing crisis. And so a lot of people in construction lost their jobs, and they reshuffled into mining and logging. So it was also the shale gas boom. And so that was the major shuffling story out of the last recession. In this recession, construction is okay. And now we're looking at real declines in mining and logging. So all those shale gas workers have to find work somewhere else. And then we're seeing here at the bottom of the page, big declines in educational services and in leisure and hospitality. Now, I think, of course, as we recover, some of those educational services and leisure and hospitality jobs are going to come back, but a lot of those workers will need to reallocate. So United Airlines is talking about maybe 3 years or more before their employment gets back to pre-pandemic levels, which means in the interim that a lot of those workers are going to end up in a different industry.
Yeah, and I think, looking at some of the ones at the top of the page, financial activities, almost back to where it was before, not as big of a fall off as we talked in previous webinars. Looking at the stock market, looking at companies that offer credit tend to be doing quite well. Retail trade, we'll dive into the individual types of businesses. We call those subsectors, but the individual types of businesses there. Yeah, from a talent acquisition standpoint, there have certainly been people that have, been a little bit busier than others refilling roles, and we'll continue to step through that kind of theme as we go throughout the webinar today. Now, you mentioned there some of the ones at the bottom of the list. In particular, if we look at the leisure and hospitality industry, without a doubt, not even close, it has been impacted more than others. The one extra one you would put at like a really granular level would be in the information sector, and that's like movies and music and those types. But if we focus on leisure and hospitality, so primarily you're talking about restaurants, hotels, entertainment venues, sporting events, those types of things. Some of the analysis that we did recently was we wanted to look at the rest of the economy. So if we take the part that we know is really going to struggle until COVID-19 is behind us, and we take that out of the mix, depending especially on the metro, it can paint quite a different picture. For those on the line that are in Texas or do business in Texas, you'll appreciate there will be a little bit of a Texas theme throughout this, because if we look at some of the places that are holding up a little bit better, Austin would be one of them. So it's actually one market that if you remove leisure and hospitality, the rest of the market has already recaptured all the lost jobs.
Yeah, it's really pretty remarkable. And you can think about leisure and hospitality as being sort of a mechanical shutdown, right? I mean, they're just not allowed to operate at capacity. And so what you hope is that robust job market elsewhere in the economy means that when this virus is over and we can turn that leisure and hospitality sector back on, that the rest of the economy is going to be able to support it. There will be people with disposable income to go to restaurants and hotels, concerts, that whole list you just gave, that will still have the buying capacity to be able to do that. And so far, I think that is true.
And you look at some of the other markets that are close, we have them listed on the right side of the page. Dallas, not far behind. Phoenix and Tampa are two of the others that are roughly within about 2% if you take leisure and hospitality out of the mix. So again, yeah, kind of the theme there is people are itching to get out and be able to go to restaurants when businesses open up, go to conferences and travel and so on. These could be some places, if you are in, as an example, I know I have somebody in the rental housing industry that's on the line. The rest of the economy is holding up pretty good. When you add those jobs back, those markets should take off, I would imagine, once again. Now, part of the other thing that we're looking at, we're known obviously for salary answers with what we do here at ThinkWhy with our product Labor IQ. And so we're constantly monitoring, what is happening with various roles and depending on which industry you work for and so on. Now, some of the impact that we're seeing today, at least from a macro level, we got, as Stephanie mentioned at the beginning, there's 20,000 different job titles, and each one of them, depending on your experience and education level, certainly you can see a wider impact than what we're looking at on the screen. But from a really macro level, Marianne, we're seeing that some of the low-skilled jobs, we do have leisure and hospitality. It's not that they're all low-skill in that industry, but we are seeing some of the low-skilled jobs where wage growth has been a little bit lower. And then those that are a little bit more high skill and financial and business services will have a little bit larger share of that on a relative basis. Those tend to be hanging in there a little bit better.
Yeah, I think the real story of this slide is just how tight this window is. I mean, even in an industry that's just been pummeled by job losses, you're still seeing 3% wage growth. So a little bit like a sale at Neiman Marcus. It's on sale, but it's still crazy expensive, right? And so there's not a huge bargain to find, even in the leisure and hospitality market.
Well, we will come back to that clothing theme here in a second, believe it or not. But yes, I would say the other thing, listening to some podcasts of acquaintances that, mentioning places like, and it's not within these sectors here, but certain businesses where to get people off the sidelines from the extra unemployment benefits they were receiving, that they've had to offer a little bit more and pay even for some of those blue collar jobs to be able to get people to come in and work at those wages. So another interesting thread to what we've seen in terms of wage growth so far. Now, let's dig just a little bit deeper. So we started at a pretty macro level all the way US. We dove down into, industries, but if we go a level below that and look at, which specific types of companies have more employees today than a year ago. So today, even, compared to pandemic and all, if you look at stores, so your kind of Home Depots and Lowe's type stores, because people are, sitting at home and realizing all the stuff that they could renovate in their house. And so they, go into those building material, garden equipment stores. Food and beverage, getting a large benefit. So instead of going to restaurants or being able to go to restaurants, food and beverage stores, benefiting from that. Then you see general merchandise stores, we can get, also get clothing and some other stuff as well. Computer equipment, delivery services, insurance carriers, investment firms, and then warehousing and storage. So, one of the things that I think of, Marianne, is, well, some of these businesses, once a vaccine comes along, could some of these actually head back the other direction?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think what we've learned in this pandemic is people like to spend money. And you close down one avenue for spending money and travel and restaurants, and people found other avenues, right? So they spent it on garden equipment and computers instead. And yes, I think what we should expect is that as those avenues for travel and restaurants reopen, that your spending on these substitutes will decline. I don't think there's any question about that.
I wanted to note as well, too, I know we've got a couple of people on the call and a few clients as well that specifically handle government contracts. I know this is about businesses specifically, but the federal government would be on this list as well, right, Jay?
Yeah, some of it is from a bump from census hiring, but obviously, I think with everything going on with COVID and so on, there's just more stuff that is taking longer to get through. So I've talked with the people in certain government roles here in Dallas that their job still takes 2 or 3 times longer because of the extra models they're having to run and so on. So yeah, federal government would make this list as well if we weren't focused on kind of businesses and companies. Good point there. I think one of the other things just to mention, we'll cover a little bit deeper list as it relates by metro, but this is at the national level. So if we just about every location that we look at, these types of businesses are doing well, but generally things in technology, I would add to this mix. And certain parts, Marianne, as we've talked about, what you might think in a pandemic, you might think healthcare should make the list, and it's not on here, but I would say that certain parts are, depending on which location that you look at. So I teased this, and here also comes the clothing and accessory store number that I referenced earlier. We'll get to that. But one of the things we wanted to cover was it really matters your location. So if you're in talent acquisition, in your market, it can be a lot different than another market in the same state or the same region of the country. You might be the only place in the whole U.S. where jobs are being added in that field. So that's actually fairly similar with Dallas. Clothing and accessory stores, believe it or not, even when we can't really get out and go anywhere, people still want to buy their clothes here. And so those jobs, this morning, we got the brand new, by location numbers earlier this morning. And so we popped those in here, and that number actually got better. It's hard to believe that, yes, in that category today versus a year ago in Dallas, there are almost 12% more employees. It's hard to believe, and Dallas was only, at least the last time I looked, one of only maybe a few places in the country that could say that, where that category was up year over year. Looking at some of the other ones, Marianne, any of the themes that you see, manufacturing in Austin tends not to be up in most places, but it is there.
Yeah, and one of the things I've been worried about this whole time is construction. I know I mentioned it earlier because we're so sensitive to it after the 2008 recession. And we worried, I think, that state and local governments were running out of cash and they would stop funding construction projects. And so far, you don't seem to be seeing that. And so seeing this big result for Salt Lake City, 11% annual job growth in construction, is just enormous. So these are all really good signs because it means there are places for for leisure and hospitality workers to go, even if it's not in their current metro area, that there are places in the country where jobs are really booming.
And so a note for those that are dialed in, these are not necessarily the only, and usually not the only specific subsectors or types of businesses that are positive. As an example, data processing and hosting in LA, there are multiple other markets that are also showing growth there. Software publishers in Boston, similar type thing. The ones that are a little bit more particular to the metros would be in Austin. Manufacturing generally is down in most places, but Austin, I think Denver might be another where it's positive. Clothing, accessory stores, as I mentioned there in Dallas. And then in Indianapolis, a place where construction's doing well also, you have food services and drinking places. So bars and restaurants. And Stephanie, I know that you work closely with our clients, and there's some folks in food services, drinking places, restaurants in particular that are doing well, even though that's not the national trend.
Tends to be some of the smaller locations, smaller metros, which you don't have some of those listed on the screen, but some of the smaller metros specifically for the restaurant space or leisure and hospitality haven't been impacted as much as you would see in, for example, in LA or Orlando.
Which is why it is very important that you have great data to know what is happening in your industries and your locations, if you've watched any of our videos that we have on LinkedIn and elsewhere. So if we roll that back up though, and we look at specific businesses first, if we roll that back up and just look at the overall metros, this is where things sit as of the data that was published this morning. And we're mainly looking here at the largest of large metros. So I think all of these have 2 million people employed or more. So from a talent acquisition standpoint, lots of people out there to recruit into your organizations. But if we look at the impact, and we'll show a map after this to give you a little bit different visual that I think will paint somewhat of a clear picture for you in terms of where, what places have been more impacted than others. But Phoenix there at the top of the list of these big guys that are on the screen, down roughly 4% from where it was before COVID, still has 94,000 jobs to gain. We jump all the way down to the bottom with New York, 1.1 million. Marianne, when you think about this list, some of the places that have been impacted and some of the ones that have not, we'll get to the forecast, but where do you see them struggling today?
Well, I'll say that just looking at the numbers from this morning versus a month ago, I mean, the three at the bottom of the list have barely budged. So I think we're not going to know for sure what's going to happen in San Francisco, LA, New York, these really big metros that have been really impacted. We're not going to know for sure until the virus is under control, and it's not in those places, or at least their restrictions would indicate that they're concerned that it's not. I think what you wonder about is two things. You wonder in the long run, how many people are going to live in San Francisco in a remote work world, given how expensive it is? And then even if they live in San Francisco, are they going to commute into their offices? And so I expect that they won't, right? That work from home will be a semi-permanent feature of the American economy. And so you're going to see a reallocation within San Francisco of jobs because you had all of these jobs downtown, accommodating downtown workers who now are only going to be there 2 or 3 days a week. You also would see, for example, in San Francisco and in New York, you would see real agglomeration around public transportation lines to get into the city. And again, if you're only going to do that 2 or 3 days a week, then you might see less agglomeration and more kind of urban or suburban sprawl, more spread out than you otherwise would. So the geography of jobs in these places is really likely to change.
Yeah, as Marianne references there, a few things. So again, all of these are big places. They have large downtowns, and for the most part, whether it's downtown or uptown or something close, you tend to have a lot of businesses, people travel down there. San Francisco, obviously, in a lot of ways, has been more progressive than other parts of the country. Not saying it's right or wrong. It'll certainly be an interesting one to watch. We have a blog that we published a few weeks ago. You could read more about that. But even as we get past COVID, there are proposals there where the majority of the workforce, if you're at a large company, would need to be remote on any given day. And so just again, the interesting, not that it's right or wrong, that's not what we're here to look at. It's really about what impact would it have on the talent within that market, and do they move from certain locations out to others? And so, there have been books of death of the suburbs, and which was really, I think, more of a re-urbanization of the suburbs. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out and to see if remote work, how long, whether it's San Francisco or some of these others, how much does it shift? Because I know that Stephanie and I have discussions around, is this remote work has gone from a perk to an expectation in many cases. And so we will see with all of these metros how that ends up impacting things as we get a little bit down the road. Now, the last one here before we change topics just a little bit would be the same type of information. We just try to put it on a map for you just to show you on a relative basis the least amount of jobs to recover, which is in your darkest of blue there on the screen, and the most amount of jobs to recover. So right there you tend to see, and as you think, as we get further into the presentation and look at our projections for 2021 and 2 and beyond, you'll see this same type of theme where, you know, the ones with the least amount of jobs that will likely recover earliest are going to be in your Southwest, South, a little bit into the Midwest, but it's definitely regionally focused. And as we progress, you'll see that again. If you look at long-term population trends, we'll talk about that. It shouldn't be a surprise either. So there are a lot of things that are pointing us to these will likely be the places to recover first.
So we spoke about wage impact by experience and skill set earlier, and you can certainly see the impact on those with less experience or education on wages. So let's shift to the topic of diversity quickly. I know when we're working with clients, we oftentimes get questions about diversity initiatives and specifically how trends differentiate as you look at gender and age and race. Marianne, I know this is something that you have been studying. Can you share some insights into the differences of impact from COVID on different demographic groups?
Sure. So I think this is a really powerful slide. It almost speaks for itself, but you can, in this gender breakdown of labor force participation. So this is just, you know, the number of men and women in this country who are participating either as workers, so they're employed, or they're looking for a job, they're unemployed and searching. And you can see that those numbers had been converging. And in fact, there was a lot of celebration among labor economists late last year and early this year as the number of women employed in this country exceeded the number of men employed for the very first time. It was a real hallmark moment. And what's happened since then is that women were laid off at higher numbers during this downturn. So you can see that as that white curve declines in March, that it declines further for women than it does for men. And that's about, a lot of that is about sectors. So a lot of women are in services professions, they're in healthcare or education services, the hardest hit industries, leisure and hospitality. And then as we started to recover in May and June, things got better. And in fact, we got back to sort of equality. But what's happened in the last 2 months is that as schools have failed to reopen across the country, and again, not a statement of right or wrong, but it's just the way it has played out, is that women have been leaving the labor force again. So they regained their status midsummer, and then again, as sort of as the reality of the childcare situation this fall came to be clear, then you're seeing them leaving again. And so that's something that I think is concerning, both, you know, from a society perspective, but also thinking about the long run implications for those women's careers. And for employers on the call, the big question is, you know, what can you do to kind of bridge the gap for the next year or even 6 months, right? If schools reopened in January, what could you do for female employees or female hires to kind of help them make it that far so that they can regain their labor force participation rates that they were seeing earlier in the summer?
And I think one of the things that we talked about, you know, along with this is not necessarily a new trend. Some of the data that we had pre-COVID showed that, you know, and this is looking at what female and male who bore the childcare costs in terms of time spent, whether you telecommuted, you know, both parents telecommuted, only one. Marianne, in terms of the results, what are you seeing?
Jay, no offense, but what I see is that men refuse to do more than 6 hours of childcare a week, no matter what their work situation. So, no, what you see here is that even for women who are going into the office and men who are at home, so that's the second cluster of bars there, you still see that women do more childcare than men do. And these are pre-COVID data on this screen, but if you look at the data for what's happened since, then these differences are just elevated. So when kids left school in March and went home, then the numbers for women and men both rose, but they rose a lot more for women than they did for men. And so again, the broad interpretation of the female labor force participation declines in the last couple of months is about childcare issues and just not being able to do it all in the current pandemic.
Yeah, so guys on the call, do your part, okay? And then employers on the call, same sort of thing that Marianne mentioned earlier, is that you often, you know, whether that employee is visible or not, understanding likely what they're doing when they're away from the office and the other part of kind of their life if they have children. If they're a woman, they tend to be taking care of kids more. So just understand that, I'd say, particularly as we step through the rest of this pandemic. Now, you're also going to show the previous slide we just looked at where we're indexing what's happening with the labor force, doing that also by race.
Yes. So again, you know, the story prior to the pandemic was one of convergence, and recoveries often look like this, that Black and African American workers are harder hit by recessions, and as the economy recovers, it disproportionately benefits minority workers. And so that's what you were seeing in the run up to March, was Black Americans continuing to sort of regain traction after the last recession. And then March hits, and you can see once again that it has a disproportionate impact even in the first month. So more Black and African American workers left the labor force in March than white as a percentage. And some of that is about sectors. In fact, a lot of that March story is about the types of industries that workers are in. Black and African American workers tend to be in the services, so leisure and hospitality, healthcare, education, and not to be in sectors like manufacturing and construction, which in this recession fared better. What you're seeing in more recent months is that you're just not getting the rehiring rate among Black and African Americans as you are among whites. So it's just a weaker recovery. One of the things for women, you know, some of the labor force participation declines have been about childcare. And economists think that among Blacks and African Americans, the declines in participation in the last couple of months aren't necessarily about childcare, but they may be about the impact of the virus itself. So in survey data, it seems to be the case that Black workers are more concerned about the impact of the virus on their health. And that is, you know, in many cases well-founded. So there are more, you know, pre-existing conditions among this community than there would be among white Americans. More multi-generational households. So lots of reasons why workers might be hesitant to go into a populated workplace. And so again, for employers on the call, the question is, you know, how can you accommodate in the short run for a long run outcome? Can you bridge the gap for the next 6, 12 months with remote work in order to retain or gain this employee for the long run?
Yeah, and again, to your point about industry, look outside of your own industry and more options can likely open up. Now, another thing we're looking at is some of the small business data, and we're going to really focus here on the immediate aftermath, just because of the gap that it creates from that point until things recover. And things have been getting better based on the most recent data we've seen. But Marianne, if you can speak to, you know, what happened with small business owners and how that breaks down demographically as well.
Well, small business owners are so important. So they're 50% of U.S. employment is in small businesses, and they have been pummeled by this pandemic. And so a lot of businesses closed. And so what this is showing you is of the businesses that were open in February, what share were closed in June. And so you can see that for a Black owned business, you know, almost 20% were closed 4 months later. And for white owned businesses, that number is much lower. And there's a smaller but still important discrepancy between female and male owned businesses. What this figure doesn't show you, and that I think is probably really important, is that there's also business creation going on. So what we do know that there are people who are leaving unemployment, or even while they're earning unemployment, they are opening a new business, a consulting business, or some other type of kind of work from home business. And those new business startups will be an important part of the recovery. We don't have those data by demographic, but it is an important part of the recovery.
And then I think this is one of the final points that we have in this section is looking at it by age and at college graduates. You know, this obviously got a lot of talk after the last recession and how it impacted young graduates in terms of, you know, getting on their footing within their career. Some of the latest data points, or some of the data points, are unemployment rate for 20 to 24-year-olds. They were preparing to graduate into the strongest economy in 50 years. And that was at the start of their spring semester. And before the spring semester ended, it went from 6.4% unemployment to 25.7%. Just world got completely turned upside down. You know, it's back down to 12.5% in September. And obviously that, it's come down a lot, it's still above the overall, but Marianne, there are some longer term impacts just between the period where things spiked and even once they fully recover.
Yes, and I will say one of the hardest days of my professional career was telling my undergraduates in March before they fully realized what was happening, having to tell the graduating seniors what I thought was about to happen. It's really hard. And part of the reason it's so hard is that there are long lasting effects. So as this slide indicates, we tend to think that that graduating during a recession is associated with about a 10% reduction in your earnings, and that holds on for at least a decade. So 10 years later in the labor market, you can still tell who graduated in a recession and who didn't. The numbers you cited are huge, right? A 25% unemployment rate is just almost unheard of. So that means 1 in 4 college graduates can't find a job. And even those who are employed are likely to be underemployed. That's been the story from my graduates is I have a job, but it's not the job I thought I would have. And it's certainly not my dream job. What we tell students in these circumstances when you're graduating in a recession, our typical advice is, well, you should just go to graduate school, wait it out in graduate school. And as you know, going to graduate school right now is also a bit of a miserable experience. You're likely to be fully online. You're not likely to make good connections with your classmates. So there are not a ton of great options for Americans in this age group.
Yeah. Sobering stats for sure, but if we start to go beyond that, we do believe we have some good news if we look ahead.
Yeah, so now that we've set the stage for where we've been, let's put some focus specifically on expectations for 2021 and beyond. One of the things that clients do appreciate about Labor IQ is having that crystal ball view into the future. As I'll note, there is an opportunity to sign up for early access to the 2021 Jobs Market Outlook, which will be included in the follow-up email you'll receive of this presentation. So Jay, can you share a bit about what will happen in different markets and industries and how we can see the impact in the labor market in the years to come?
Sure, and we'll get to some of our own statistics. I know Marianne and I both like to look at the Wall Street Journal Economist survey that comes out each month. There's always some interesting stuff in there. And I'll use it as to kind of enter into our outlook. So first, from a GDP perspective, the question was asked, when will it get back to Q4 2019 levels? And so this survey was taken, by the way, at the beginning of October, I think from the 2nd to the 6th. And when those 60 plus economists were surveyed, more than half, 57%, thought that by the end of next year, GDP would be back. And then another 18%, so you layer that on, you're getting more like 2/3 to 3/4 now of economists think that by the very beginning of 2022, we'll be back. More job growth would result from that. So Marianne, if you can explain, to the participants on the line a little bit about that, what GDP means and how it's going to translate to for talent acquisition folks, how busy they're going to be once rehiring really gets kicked into high gear.
Yeah. So GDP just means revenue. Think about it that way. Okay. So worldwide or nationwide revenue will be back to where we were in the fourth quarter of 2019. By these measures at the end of 2021 or maybe Q1 of 2022. Now, what typically happens in a recession and a recovery is that a year after you get back to full production or revenue, then you get back to full employment. So it takes a full year after you get back to where you were in production to get back to where you were in employment, which means you're running hot internally within an organization for a full year. You're making what you made before with fewer workers. And that lag is about the hiring process, right? It's about being sure that you have enough, demand to hire this extra worker. And then once you've said, yes, I think I have the demand to hire the extra worker, now I've got the process of onboarding that worker. So as we talked earlier about the shuffle, right? Moving from one industry to another or one company to another, all of that takes time. And so the numbers here would indicate that, if we do get back to our production levels by the end of next year, it'll be the end of 2022 before we are back to our employment levels.
Yeah, so for those of you that really look at forward-looking indicators in your businesses, so KPIs that project sales out, if you're in talent acquisition, just know that as folks are looking at that, you should start to see, if you're a company like us and you do webinars or sales orders, you should start to see some of that progress building earlier in the year, that would result in the GDP once we get to the back half of the year. Because by the way, that is really backloaded. Almost all of it is in the second half of 2021. So your leading indicators, hopefully over the next 6 or so months, we will start to see those turn the corner again. Very virus dependent on a lot of that, but good news from that angle. Now, there's something that one of my other frequent guests that visits with us here, another executive advisory board member at ThinkY, is Dr. Sam Shannon, Dean of Real Estate at NYU. I've been doing presentations with Sam for, I don't know, a decade probably. And I know that 7 or 8 years ago, he would break out this sort of visual, and he has recently on one of our webinars here at ThinkY. So I thought I would walk you through it, mainly to show you what the projection, how the projection compares to past recessions. So if this is your first time through it, let me explain real fast. What we're doing is looking at some of the last few recessions and looking at how many months did it take from the time the recession started. So when did from a job loss perspective, when did it start to occur? How long till we hit the bottom? And then when did we get back to the previous full employment level? So if we go back to the 1990 or the 2001, it took roughly about 12 or so months, maybe a year to year and a half before we actually hit bottom and things started to improve from an employment level. And then it took almost 3 years from the time it started till the time it stopped and we got back to full employment. So that's what happened then. That looks pretty shallow compared to, for those of you who are more familiar maybe with the Great Recession, because that was either part of your career or it was just so much more challenging maybe than those other two. So that one took almost 2 years, right around 2 years before we actually stopped losing employees, gained some footing, and then started to increase back. And you can see it took more than 80 months or so till we actually gained back all the jobs that were lost. Now this time, it was not 12 months or 24 months. We hit bottom in about 6 weeks. And the trough was much, much, much deeper than the last 3+ combined. And so you'll see there, we lost about 16% or so of employment. You can see we've made a little bit more than half of that back. So now when we start to really layer in the outlook, what does that look like? Now, that Wall Street Journal one that I showed you just before showed that the largest amount was in 2023, and there was another big bunch in 2022. So that's fairly in line with the labor IQ forecast that gets us back by Q1 2023. So if we layer on what that looks like, we're talking about history in a lot of different ways, from how bad things got to how good they got fast. Marianne, what do you think?
Well, I think, if you look at this, I think the big message is it would be a recovery that's much stronger than the 08-09 recovery, right? I mean, the 08-09 recovery is famous for being a slow, steady, but slow and painful recovery. And so this one would be much faster. And the reasons that's a reasonable forecast is that we started this recession in such a strong position. Historically low unemployment rates, we had huge wage growth. The lower end of the income distribution was experiencing most of that wage growth. So we really were in a quite strong position. And so I think economists and you guys, other forecasters are thinking about it as this is going to be a unique situation. We're going to be able to grow out of this much more quickly than we could, 10 or 12 years ago. And I sure hope you're right.
And I hope we and the other folks that are somewhere around our forecast, yes, I hope that we are. Now, I start to think about it a little bit different way, and Stephanie, who's here with me, has been a hiring manager for most of her career. So Stephanie, when you think about having to bring on that many people that fast, where does your head go?
The amount of hiring, I mean, if we just look at how quickly that recovery comes about, having to do that much hiring in a short period of time, you're already understaffed. And the amount of effort that goes into the hiring and onboarding process is incredible. So my thought goes to it's going to be a lot of work to get there that quickly, but I think we're all ready for it.
Yes. So, I've told people talent acquisition is going to be the place to be in terms of demand, because to add people that fast from a sourcing standpoint, getting them to the interview, again, hiring managers going through the interview, then you got, for internal training, goodness. But that's the base expectation. So our heroes in this are going to be the people who can actually get these folks into our businesses. Now, if we take that and we start to look at, okay, that's what the overall line looks like. Some of those, again, the troughs aren't as deep. Like we talked about financial activities earlier, it didn't drop off nearly as much. Some of them are much deeper. Leisure and hospitality, you know, depending on where you are, might have lost half the jobs or more, not 16%. So because of that, it's going to take certain parts of our economy a little bit longer, and certain parts will come back faster. So in terms of our base outlook, financial activities, retail trade, which I might touch on here in a second, healthcare, construction, professional and business, those are going to be the industries that we believe that will rebound faster. Now, certain parts within those overall industries, as I've mentioned earlier, are already back. Now, maybe in certain markets they're back and certain ones are not, but there are certain ones that pretty much across the board are back. I'll start with retail. So on retail, we mentioned grocery stores are back right now, but we should start to see when people are actually able to get out and they're going on trips, they're doing all of that, you will start to see the other parts of retail fill in. Healthcare, you know, elective surgeries, people putting things like that off. You know, we do believe once the market comes back to a normal sort of spot, you know, you'll see other parts of healthcare return. But Marianne, when you think of things that are a little bit more lagging on this list, you know, what could you see you slow it down? I know you mentioned as an example airlines earlier with transportation.
Yeah, I think that's a big one. I just point out as a point of reference here that the construction industry in the last recession took more than 12 years to recover. So, you know, if you think leisure and hospitality in 2025 is pessimistic, I have news for you, right? Yeah, I do think that, you know, there are going to be some of these sectors that are really going to struggle. I think airlines is number one, and they know it. They're telling you that, right? That this is going to be one of the last things to come back. Not because people are going to continue to be nervous about the virus in 2024 and 2025, but because people's activities will have changed. And in particular, business travel will have changed. And I think we know it, right? I mean, I spent today visiting with my colleagues at Duke University via Zoom. And it's much cheaper for me to visit with them that way than it is to go in person. And companies are discovering that right and left. So I think what the airline industry is telling you is that they know that business practices are changing, even if leisure travel doesn't.
Yeah, and I think with specifically looking at transportation and then again on leisure and hospitality, it's going to depend on the type of business. So let's imagine things fully reopen tomorrow. If I want to go to a restaurant, I can pick up and go immediately. If I want to take a trip and take my kids to Disney World, it's going to take a little bit more logistical planning. So there will just be certain parts, you know, from a business standpoint, it's more about the big conferences. How long will it take for them to fully get back and businesses get those on their, you know, budgets for the next year and so on. So it's just going to depend on which ones have a little bit, you know, more of a logistical challenges versus other ones that can, you know, on a relative basis, flip the switch. Again, I'll point out here that it really matters. So if you are, I was with a group of, you know, 20 or so very socially distanced people in talent acquisition, they're external recruiting firms last week, and, you know, went around the table, and it really depends on who we talk to and what their industry felt like. And so, again, part of the reason you would use Labor IQ is for our market analytics, and you can go in there and see which of these industries are going to come back. These are the people that are going to need help and help fastest. So in terms of what it looks like by location, you know, certain markets, again, coming back a bit faster. You got Atlanta, Austin, Dallas, Denver, Phoenix. They're kind of on the front edge of it. If we go across the list, I'll tell you some of the ones I'm less comfortable with. Chicago would be one. So we have it coming back in 2023, but it's kind of later 2023, and it feels more like it would fit in with LA and Las Vegas in 2024. By the way, Boston's not on the list. It would be in 2024 as well. New York lagging, just a, you know, major impact. And I would wonder, just with regulation, you know, when we look at small businesses coming back, where can small businesses come back the fastest? And New York would be one place that I would worry about. As an example, by the way, we'll talk about migration stats, but New York, I believe, from 2010 to 2019, the state added 53,000 people. Here in Dallas, the suburb of Frisco added more like 70,000. So we're seeing, you know, it's not getting the population growth that you're seeing in other parts of the country. Now you've got the COVID impact, what it's going to be like to restart. So New York, I could see struggling, and Honolulu is really from a travel impact. Marianne, if we look at what that looks in terms of, okay, put it on a map and then layer in, you know, the rest of kind of the top 50 markets by size, this is the first time you're seeing this image. So I'm curious of what you think, particularly if you look at the bottom left.
Yeah, what I was thinking when you're talking about those really slow recovery locations, and I know Las Vegas is 2023, but still what I was thinking is that the slowest locations on that list are places that rely on international travelers, Honolulu and New York, I put Seattle in that group, San Francisco, places that really need that international travel to be fully operational are gonna recover last. And same for places that rely on conferences. So when you say Las Vegas, some people think gambling or whatever, and I think conferences. And so I think that's part of the story for Las Vegas, probably also part of the story for Chicago. But your story, your tale about growth in Frisco relative to New York is just really important. We're in an ongoing reshuffling of population in this country, moving from colder locations to warmer locations and moving out of the biggest cities and into smaller kind of second tier cities. And so this pandemic, I think, by all expectations, is just accelerating that process.
Yeah, then if we look, again, some of this should not be a surprise. If you look at, kind of the middle part, southern part of the country is what was growing. So some of that is related to, closures we've seen, the different policies, what impact that's had on businesses, again, which ones where the underlying economy, particularly if you go back towards the beginning part of our presentation, you take, hotels and restaurants and all of that out of the mix, and which ones is the rest of the economy healthy? They tend to be those kind of in that section in the middle and southern part of the country. But you look at migration patterns, and I just started to reference this just a second ago. So the U.S. population, if you look from 2010 to 2019, grew by 18.9 million people. 90% of that growth was in the South and in the West. So the other 10% happened in, kind of the Northeast, Midwest area of the country. Texas alone, during that point, accounted for 20% of the growth. So if these migration patterns continue to happen, I would think, for sure, Texas and Florida, based on what we've seen. Of the other really big state, California, that's the one, that we've already referenced, Marianne, when it comes to, unemployment rates have been much more impacted there than you've seen. Again, some different policies than you've seen from some other states in terms of the length of business closures. And then you layer remote work and then cost of living on top of all of that. And I just wonder, what is that going to do to this mix? I expect California still to grow, but I do wonder about what this mix looks like if we project it out over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, some people moved to California for the great weather. They didn't move there for the low cost of living, right? So they moved there for the great weather and the jobs. And so if you no longer have to move to California to get the job, then where would you choose to move instead? And I think that's going to be one of the defining features of these migration patterns going forward is I don't have to be in any particular location. I can work remotely. Where do I really want to live? Where's a low tax state that I might really want to live?
Yeah, and apologies for picking on California a few times, especially with already some challenges going on there. But I do think those are things that you look at when you're thinking about, your business and who you're serving in the coming years. That we've seen these patterns developing with COVID. We're seeing, a couple other things that tend to point to other markets that look like they might have a little bit more growth opportunity. Wages. So kind of looking at one of the last few things here, if we think about what wage growth is like, some folks were maybe surprised that very early when this happened, that there was actually a spike where the numbers went up a lot in terms of wages. That will not be sustained. Most likely, it's not unusual to see a little bit of an increase, but we had a lot of blue collar type jobs removed. And when you do that, just based on some of those survey methods, it caused this spike. I think the real thing is that is a little bit of noise. And by the way, there are some blue collar jobs where wages did go up. I think the main thing to point you through, so Stephanie referenced it in the kicking off of this section, that one of the things that we offer with the product is not just today's wage or last year's, but what is the salary projected in the future? Listen, it's really going to vary. If you're in technology roles versus some of these others, the growth will vary. You need to really dial into the position and the type of company and the size and all of that, the candidate themselves. But generally, what you would expect in the year following a recession is then when you start to see that impact on wage growth. And so next year, we have it decelerating down till the end of next year to about 2%. And then to take us to the end, in terms of risk of outlook. So, Marianne, I think if we, the good thing is that we have an idea what a lot of the risks are. Oftentimes, when you're heading into a recession, you're not exactly sure what's going to cause it. Now where we are, we seem to be able to look at a variety of things and know that, okay, well, if this happens, that'll delay it, or if this happens, maybe things will speed up. So what are you thinking in terms of greatest risks to the forecast that we've talked about so far?
This is a great list. Honestly, I think these are the four biggest risks. So the vaccine itself, I listened to Scott Gottlieb, who's the former FDA chief, on the radio this weekend, and he said, well, even people that you vaccinate in December aren't going to be fully immune until March or April. And I wasn't expecting that delay. So that added a quarter to my expectations about when we might fully recover, right? So there'll be lots of surprises, I think, in the vaccine manufacturing and distribution process that are really going to impact the forecast. We don't know what's going to happen in Washington. We wrote on here lack of stimulus, but it's also, of course, about who wins the presidential election and how all of those politics will play out in terms of ongoing support. And the virus is coming back. That's the real unfortunate news of the last few weeks, is that there are places in the U.S. that are having to reconsider their opening status and considering closing back down. And then the last thing I would just add to this logistics challenge, as you think about the opening up of jobs, so not only do you have an 8% unemployment rate, which already means you're going to have a flood of talent applying for a job, but also you have removed a lot of geographic restrictions, certainly in white collar jobs. So I have a lot of people looking for a job, and I can accept applications from all over the country. You're likely to have really large applicant pools for certain types of roles. And so as Stephanie was saying, just sorting through those and interviewing and training and getting people onboarded is going to be harder now than it was 12 months ago. And so that rehiring process is likely to have some serious lags.
And this is a good time right before we offer our final thoughts that if anyone has any questions, go ahead and submit them. We did get one in just a second ago that goes along with this, that one of the risks, and Marianne, you already started to address it there, is that with the virus counts picking back up, particularly the question had to do with Texas and with Florida, what impact with that, along with, say, hurricanes, could we end up seeing? And that's part of the risk here. I think that the question is going to be just how long does it last, in terms of, if there is a surge, how long does it last? What is the response, and so on. Those are things I'll tell you that as we went to project out and through the end of this year and early next year, there are periods where we could be looking at negative job growth from one month to another if things do start to stall. We didn't cover it as much at the beginning part, but that slide where we looked at Austin and the U.S. total, and if you took leisure and hospitality out, what did it show? The curve has been flattening. And so any additional challenges, that was one of the things that as we enter in cold and flu season, we start to see some of these numbers spike up. Yeah, there are some places that could slow down, but I would say we're still big believers in both of the states, if we say go 12 months out on those trends. So Marianne, any final thoughts to wrap us up here today?
Well, I was just going to add something to what you just said to Kate, which is that, one of the reasons this has been so difficult to predict for labor economists is that sometimes when the virus shows up in one place, you get job market challenges in another place. So this summer, what happened, if you remember, is that the virus really kind of resurged in the South, in places like Tennessee and Arizona and Texas were struggling, and job growth in Tennessee and Arizona and Texas didn't slow down. But job growth in New York and California did, because New York and California kind of proactively locked down, trying to prevent the same thing from happening there. So it's just a real challenge to predict. The good news is that this Labor IQ product and economic data is updated every month. So you really can get a real-time view of what's happening as it's happening by just using these real-time data to show you what wages are doing, what employment is doing, and how that differs by metro area or by company type. Okay,
yeah, and then I would add on, we're still very optimistic that once we get past this, things could recover fast, because again, underlying economics are still favorable. So it's really about, I think, getting the vaccine. The big part, and we didn't include it in our material today, but if you go to Pew Research's website, they have some material on, who is most likely to take the vaccine and who is not. And I don't think it's going to be a slam dunk that even if it's available, that everyone's going to get it. And so what does that mean? So obviously a lot of risks that are out there. it's just about getting past this pandemic, and we believe the job market will be good to go after that. So with that, we can turn it over. We just have time for maybe a couple of questions. One of them, by the way, is can we get this deck? I believe that will be sent out, or a link to it will be sent out after this. And then Stephanie, any other questions that you've received up to this point?
I have one other question for the two of you. Specifically, I know we brought up the stimulus. I guess from your perspective, do you think that we need another round of stimulus? And if so, how big does that need to be?
I think it's a great question. Jay may have his own set of opinions. I think that you're still continuing to see a lot of layoffs, right? So the most recent week was still 800,000 Americans filing for unemployment insurance for the first time in this pandemic. So a lot of layoffs. And a lot of it's coming from small businesses. And if you survey small businesses and you ask them, what do you need? And they say, we need access to capital, we need loans. So I anticipate the biggest priority out of a Washington stimulus package in the next few weeks, if it happens, or after the election, if it's delayed, would be to try to shore up small businesses and just help them bridge. And that's what small businesses are saying is, when we have a vaccine, we're viable. People are going to come back. We're good to go, but we need some way to survive between now and then. We got to pay our rent. We got to pay our overhead costs.
I agree. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, particularly if you look at some of the markets struggling, is if the business is still open, its ability to ramp up is a lot different than going through the whole process of getting the business started in the first place. And so, yeah, keeping small businesses alive should certainly be a priority. I think we're about it on time. So Stephanie, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Marianne and Jay, for the insights that you've shared today. I think it was incredibly valuable use of the last hour. As we conclude today's presentation, just a quick reminder that all attendees will receive an emailed copy of today's presentation. You'll also receive an invitation to register to get first access to our 2021 jobs market outlook. As Defy continues to monitor and forecast job recovery across locations and industries, we also report on impacts to occupations, salary demands, and talent supply. So providing you with talent solutions and market opportunity insights for strategic recruiting and hiring. There is one special offer we have for you today. If you go to thinkwhy.com/salary-report-request, you get your complimentary salary report for one of those 20,000 plus jobs that we have in our database, where you can customize by industry, by education, by experience, and company size. The link should be in your chat. So as we wrap up, a huge thanks to Jay and Dr. Wanamaker for today's insights. Thank you again for all attending, and until next time, have a great day.